Good morning, Zora. Happy Monday. How's it going?
Good morning. It's going pretty well, coming off a good weekend, so can't complain.
That's awesome. Did you do anything like remarkably fun or interesting or
No,
relaxing?
no, I mean, like just relaxing, yeah, recharging the batteries. Yeah,
It is essential and so important. I was telling people this weekend on Saturday, it was like, I'm not opening the door from Friday night to Sunday morning. This is my place. And I
yeah,
was so glad to do it. So I'm glad to hear that you had a relaxing weekend. Also, we're now on Monday morning time. Is there something that you do to get into the swing of the week? I see you with your coffee there. Maybe that's a
yeah.
big part of your routine.
Yeah, just trying to, figure out what the week looks like. And yeah, Monday's my studio day, so it's like a nice way to kind of ease into the week instead of, jumping right in. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of love how that's structured. For me too, I have internship, 8 to 4 on the days that I'm there, but on Mondays I don't start till 10. And
Yeah.
it does feel like it's like, okay, we're gonna dip our toes in it, get the feel for the week, set the pace that we want. So I think that's a great way to pace it out. But I'm so thankful that you're here and that we get to start this week together. This is Zora Murff, artist and educator. And I can't wait to see and learn about what that means for you and what you do with your talents. So we'll start in the beginning, if that's good with you. I'd love to understand, Zora, what your life was like growing up and where your art interest kind of came to be.
Yeah. Um, well, I think I've always been like as a kid, I had a very wild and vivid imagination. I am a rather internal person. I've always been really sensitive. And so I think that like those are maybe places my inclination to make art come from. But like, early in life, I wasn't exposed to I guess I would say like art with a capital A, right? Like, like going to galleries or museums. Like a lot of the art that I was exposed to was just kind of, like common everyday art, I suppose. Like listening to jazz albums with my dad. Going to my grandparents' house and flipping through old copies of Jet magazine. So, sort of being, introduced to visual culture in that way. Looking through our family albums and, like not doing it with a family, like doing it by myself and not with a family member, and sort of creating narratives, based on pictures, right? And so, I think that like being an artist was always there. It just seemed to manifest in different ways for me. I remember, my mom would always buy disposable cameras on the weekends, and I would, like, I started begging her to like, to buy me one too, and like she eventually just would, whenever she bought one, she would buy one for me too. So I was making pictures that way, but again, not really like thinking about them as art. Um, just maybe being sort of pleased with like different sorts of visual things. um and then yeah, I remember like at a cookout one time, like they had all the adults had a video camera, and then like once they sort of got bored with it, I got to take it over. And so like definitely wanting to be like in control of making images or telling the story, again, kind of just seemed to be a natural impulse. And so I didn't start studying art until I was in my early 20s, and I had picked up photography as like a hobby. I was working in social work at the time, and it that's a pretty selfless job, and can feel pretty thankless at moments. But and so I think I picked up photography as a way to have something that was purely for me. And the more I started to like take classes to learn about my camera, and like started going to like I started seeking out visual art. Um, and that's when, it really like kind of hit me that, I want to work with people. I like making art. And so, like, how do I kind of bring those two things together? And, thankfully I had a couple of really great professors as I started going back to school to study photography and art. And I had a couple of really great professors, and from them I realized like this is what I want to do. I want to be teaching people about how to make art, how to express themselves through creating something. And yeah, so I'd say that's like kind of the broad background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was
So
a beautiful story arc. And I like, thank you so much for taking us on the journey. I love that, like the Polaroid cameras, or the idea of you taking your family's photo albums and thinking about stories for them. I feel like so often I like run to the description. I want to like, absorb all the knowledge about the thing, but I don't even like take a second for like, my own thoughts about it. And I think that's very artistic that at that young age, you were like, no, like, what do I think was happening here? Or like, what do I wish was happening here? Or like, maybe what's the system that around them? Maybe they weren't conscious thoughts, but your mind was going. And that's really cool to see how that followed through. And it sounds like photography was always maybe the medium, right? Or did you ever dabble in other types of art?
I mean, I drew, like I would draw like things, but that was like, I mean, I think again it was maybe just a way of trying to like visually express myself with things that I had on hand. But it wasn't something that I like did a lot or took very seriously. I think it was just like, yeah, like if I was bored, I might like spend a couple hours like just doodling things like in a notebook, or like trying, like if there was like an image that I liked, like maybe trying to like draw like that image. But it wasn't something that like I think I ever sat down and was like, oh, I'm going to like just create this thing by drawing it or whatever. Yeah, yeah.
That
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Very cool. So when you had this disposable camera, or when you had the video camera at parties after the adults got tired of it, or maybe even like further down the line when you started really taking up photography as a hobby, did you notice that your camera gravitated toward things different than other people, or like what were you drawn to capture?
Yeah, I mean, I think gosh, like yeah, I think I don't know if there was like anything in particular that I was drawn to, but maybe it sort of I guess it facilitated um like this intentional way of looking, right? That's not dissimilar to the way that I would like look at family photographs and try to create stories for them, right? That like I guess having an understanding that like these images, like they can have meaning past like what they represent, right? So I can take a photograph of a flower, and of course we can look at it and say like this is a flower, maybe more specifically it's this type of flower, right? But that a viewer can bring other meaning to it, right? And yeah, so I think it wasn't like I wasn't necessarily drawn to like particular things, rather just like going outside with my camera and trying to like intention like seeking out something, right?
Yeah, that's so cool. I thought it was so beautiful how you said like an intentional way of looking. What a powerful idea. And like what if we could do intention, have intention in everything we do, like that would be wonderful. And so that's really cool to hear. I'd love for you to speak more about, your current work, like its style and your approach to it. In your like on your website, maybe you describe merging an artistic production with talk about social phenomena. How did that become something that you cared about? And what does that mean for you right now?
Yeah, well, I think it sort of, I guess it ties in with this idea of like looking or understanding with intention. So I studied psychology before I studied art. I had um like a 7-year stint in social services, in a broad array. And, in those environments, you have to like a lot of what you do is leading with intention, right? Because you're trying to find ways of actively decentering yourself to think on behalf of somebody else, right? And that takes a lot of like that's an act that you have to do intentionally, right? You have to like think about like, okay, this kid is screaming at me, it's not me, right? Like they're screaming because they need something, right? They need to express these emotions. Maybe they've tried to communicate something and no one's listening to them, so maybe they need me to listen. Like there's a lot of different reasons for why things happen. But when you're working with people, you have to be able to, again, sort of like think outside of yourself and think, from somebody else's position. And so, like, so I was, working with kids on probation the same time I started studying photography. And, I was having a lot of experiences in that role, again, like, where I guess like, we're as workers, like we're as social workers, we're stuck in the system. Is asking us to do particular things. And sometimes those things that we do are contradictory of sort of the mission or values of like what it is we're supposed to be doing, right? And so I think that, as I was learning photography, I was having these experiences. And then, I had this moment where I had to make, like a body of work, like a project that has like one kind of, like topic as a through line. And, I was like, I'm working full time. I'm a full-time student, so I'm just going to photograph work, right? Like that was like the easiest thing to do.
Maximum
And
efficiency.
right. But I think like all of those, like that choice, and then sort of how, I'm trying to look intentionally, being an artist, and I'm trying to understand intentionally as a social worker, those things just sort of got merged together. And yeah, and so I think that sort of set me on the path of, considering um, how systems, institutions, like whatever you want to call it, like how these things come to fruition. And specifically at that time, it was thinking about, how does photography relate to the juvenile criminal justice system, or even just the criminal justice system as a whole. And I started doing some research, and lo and behold, photography has had a very sordid relationship with the criminal justice system. It's like this foundational part of it, this idea, especially like how stigma operates. It comes from the building of a quote unquote criminal type. So you have this sort of metaphorical image, right? Image building, people with large foreheads and round noses are more likely to commit crime, right? They're saying things like that. So like building this metaphorical image. And then once the camera comes into play, like actually taking people's images and then attaching that stigma to a person, right? This person is a criminal. And again, so just like having these realizations, kind of digging deeper into that. And so I guess that work had that specificity, looking at this one phenomena. But then, as I continued study, and, as I continued research today, it's having the understanding that like this is applicable to a lot of different things. And so, just how do I continue, like how do I continue developing and broadening, that scope of research?
Yeah, that's so cool how you got to see the marriage of the research and then actually doing the photos. And that's a history that we maybe take for granted, but right, like someone had to choose. In some of these conversations we've talked about like framing, like you're choosing what to photograph, and then someone's putting words to it maybe, or context to it, that's shaping how we decide reality looks beyond that one photo. So it seems like there's a lot of responsibility in photography as well. And it's
Yeah.
really cool how your work brings to light what that means. So I will pull up the screen and we'll look at some of these really awesome projects, really powerful. So
Yeah.
this first is, I went through your website and I was like, I wish we could just show all of these things, but I was like, that would make for a really long conversation and maybe all over the place. So I chose like kind of randomly stuff that just stood out to me in the moment when I went through your
Mhm.
pages. So I don't know that they're representative, but they are pieces from these collections. So the
Yeah.
first one I'd love to understand is At No Point in Between, how this came about, where you were, just the whole story.
Yeah. So this, this work I started in graduate school. So I attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and received my MFA from there in 2018. And so it was, kind of similar, like a project similar in the sense that, I was searching for like a particular sort of theme or topic, something to like quote unquote investigate. Um, and I visited this neighborhood, North Omaha, which is in Omaha, Nebraska, 45 minutes from where I was going to school. And it's a predominantly Black neighborhood, historically Black neighborhood. And while I was there, just having experiences that like where my, like my person was validated.
Mhm.
It was like the first time, I think since I had started grad school that I was in an environment that was like majority Black. And, walking down the street and, just having someone be like, "What's up, Black man?" Like where like people see me here, right? People acknowledge me here. People aren't afraid of me, sort of all of these, different stigma that Blackness carries for white people, and exist in predominantly white spaces, like exist severely in predominantly white spaces. Like when I was in this space, those feelings like started to kind of melt away. um and so I'm having like this really like wonderful feeling, but it comes with all of this, like this place, the place that I'm in, it was coming with all of this stigma. Like I was telling people, I think I'm going to go photograph in North Omaha, and like the first thing people are like, "Be careful." I'm like, "Well, why are you worried about my safe? I feel very safe here," right? And so there's like this discrepancy. Like it being categorized as a ghetto. There's a McDonald's that's like right outside of like that's like right on the edge of the neighborhood, near this college campus, and all like a lot of the college students refer to it as the crack Donald's, because that's where all the Black people go. So like, and then like another thing that happened was like a lot of the initial stories that I heard about North Omaha were these very violent histories, where Black people are being killed by white people. And so those stories being the spectacle lynching of Will Brown in 1919. He was accused of raping a white woman, and then was lynched by a mob, and his body was brutalized by them. And there's like a really famous photograph that exists of that moment. And then in 1969, the police murder of Vivian Strong. She was a 14-year-old Black girl, was running away from a police officer, and he shot her in the back of the head as she was running away from him. And so with both of those, you know, with both of those happenings, there were large-scale riots that were, sort of categorized as race riots. But there's a marked difference between kind of collective perception of the word. So in 1919, a race riot was understood as a group of white people going to, a Black neighborhood, or like a different, like a neighborhood where people who are non-white live, right? And wreaking havoc and killing people, right? In 1969, the riots that happened after the officer who murdered Vivian Strong was acquitted, that was categorized, like there was large scale riots in North Omaha. but it was also categorized as a race riot. But at that moment in history, we understood a race riot as, um, you know, a non-white community exercising their frustrations on their physical, like on their physical surroundings, because that's the last way that they have to like to voice their concern, right? And so it's like the culmination of all of those things, you know, like there are like maybe sort of particular things that I wanted to talk about. But it like, you know, like I don't know, it, you know, it started with me interrogating my own Blackness, you know, like this identity that, you know, was assigned to me, this identity that is not of my choosing, this identity that is, you know, like it's a biological difference, right?
Mhm.
But like it's given all of this power socially, given, you know, all of these things that have happened throughout American history, right? So I think primarily it was that. Um, but then underneath it was like, you know, I had watched the murder of Laquan McDonald, this you know, this Black teenager in Chicago, who was shot by a police officer, not unlike, you know, the situation with Vivian Strong. um, and you know, I'm in this place where I'm having this experience that validates my identity, but then, you know, learning about the history of redlining. So this, you know, like this form of, you know, government authorized segregation, you know, that then creates these perceptions of the place being, you know, the quote unquote ghetto and unsafe and, you know, all of that. And so, you know, I think like the work became a way of trying to figure out like how these things are different, how they're the same, and then, you know, how is that like kind of discussed through the creation of images. um yeah, so that's that work.
Wow.
Yeah, in a nutshell.
It's amazing how you can
Yeah.
go into a project with so many um, points of history to refer to and so many desires for its outcomes. And then you can use a photo to achieve all of those things. It just blows my mind. Anytime I get to hear like more about like what's behind the photo, because you do see it depicted in these different um, layers and everything. And so I wondered if you could say anything more about these specific photos that are part of the
Yeah.
series and like also what it's like to be in the community once you got there, because you grew up in Iowa, right? Like you're not from North
No.
Omaha. And so even though there is a point of commonality, there's also a layer of outsider, maybe. Like what is that all like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all like, you know, like a pretty like what's the right word here? um yeah, I mean, it all like is not complicated, but like it can feel like it's a little convoluted, I guess. You know, I think that like there's you know, like not being from there is like something that I think about a lot, you know, because I like, you know, photography as a medium, you know, it's like like the camera is just an object, right? It's a machine, it has a particular function, it works in a particular way. Um, but once it's not necessarily harmful, right? It's just an object.
Mm.
When people come into that equation, that's when it can become harmful, right? So, you know, like there's a long history, you know, like, you know, photography as a tool for colonization, you know, photography, you know, being used in an oppressive way, like images of enslaved individuals, you know, there's a lot of, and there's a power dynamic that's present. And so, you know, whether I'm photographing people, you know, whether I'm photographing a landscape, you know, there's like a lot of I think, you know, we should always pay attention to like the intention of the images. But even like me, like saying, well, my intentions are good, so therefore my images are not harmful. Like you can't really say that, right? It's like always something that's up for debate. So I'd say it's like, yeah, just sort of complicated in that sort of sense. But that, you know, like for me, making this work was definitely a way of like acknowledging, you know, people who are often not acknowledged. You know, acknowledging this place that is, you know, typically acknowledged in negative ways, you know, is like sort of like, you know, beauty a tool, a way of like of expressing that, maybe, or maybe it's again one of those harmful things, right? But again, like that, you know, when I was there, it was just a matter of like looking and connecting. That was like kind of what I did. So like the image on the left here with the kids and the police car, that was actually like, you see that yellow house
Yeah.
and like a white house behind it. There was a fire in that white house, and I was like just over there photographed making an image of the yellow house, and then like next door there's a fire, like a legit fire that just like going,
Oh
and
my
I'm
God.
like looking around and it was just me, and I was like, all right, I guess I gotta call the fire department. So I called 911. Yeah. Oh, and mind you, this is like the last time that I made a picture in the neighborhood. Like this is like one of the last images that I made in the neighborhood.
That's trippy.
Right. But anyway, so like, yeah, like this fire, you know, is going, you know, the fire truck shows up and the police show up, and I was just sort of photographing the scene, you know, as all these things are happening. And these kids came out, like a bunch of people started coming over, and these kids came over, and, you know, they were asking me about my camera, and because it's like a film camera. And so they were like, you know, sort of fascinated with like, you know, what it did and how it functioned. Um, and then I asked if I could take, you know, a group picture of them. And so this is one of those images. And the title of it is Kids Talking About Cameras. And that's like, you know, whenever I make like a port, all the portraits in this series, like they're titled, the person's name, and then in like parentheses, it's what we were talking about, like what we had a conversation about. But that's how like I always sort of led, was, you know, I never, you know, like when I first started the work, I was in this bad habit of just like kind of approaching people and being like, hey, can I make your portrait? But like, you know, over time, I sort of shifted my practice into like just meeting people, talking with them. And then, you know, sometimes I would ask, sometimes I might not ask, you know, it just depended on the situation. But yeah, so that's like how that image came about. And that's like, you know, majority of the portraits, it's just me walking around this neighborhood. Yeah, just, you know, running into somebody and, you know, like talking with them. And, you know, like sometimes, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but like, there's like these times I feel like you see like just strangers,
Mhm.
and like there's like this connection,
For sure.
and you know that like if I start talking to this person, like they're gonna start talking to me too. Like there's something, right?
Mhm.
And that like typically the people that I photographed were those type of people, or like those types of connections where it's like, yeah, there's just something, like we're both kind of curious about the other person and wanting like that, maybe that connection or social interaction, because there's like an opening, maybe, I guess, right?
Yes.
um
So powerful. I know what you're
yeah.
talking about.
Yeah,
That's
right.
beautiful. And I love how you explained like kind of growing maybe in your confidence or your comfort level of like actually going forward with the conversation. I think that, you know, when we take the time to learn to show up in like even a fuller way, like it enables other people to show up in a fuller way too, or gives them, like in this case, the platform to actually have some dialogue with you that accompanies that photo and makes the work ultimately like speak even more of their truth, which is wonderful. And I think too, so my background is in like data and operations and stuff. And so to me, photos are kind of like the data. And when we have data, we think about, you know, what's the way that we can tell the story with it for people to like really feel it. You know, like you could write down that there's 20 white police people in whatever district, but to actually see each white face, or if in the data world, you might like write every name and then put the race at the end of it to be like, there's like 20 lines of names here. It's not just a number by itself. It really like speaks to the volume. Or in that photo on the left, like having that police car in the background of like, if you photoshopped a playground there, I would think that was also appropriate.
Right.
So I think that's really cool how you are just shining a light and making people think about things that we sometimes take for granted. And
Mhm.
I wanted, before we go to the next one, what is the meaning of the title of the series, At No Point in Between?
Yeah, so it comes from a quote that I heard on a podcast a long time ago.
I love quotes from
Yeah,
podcasts.
I don't remember. I vividly I remember I was driving back from like shooting in North Omaha. It was like dark. Um, I had gotten turned around and I had to like do all this like backtracking to
Mhm.
get back on the interstate. And like this podcast was running, and then the author was talking about like a book they had written, and it was about race, and they were talking about like sort of how historically Blackness has been perceived, that it's like kind of this like dichotomous like under like existence, when obviously like humanity is just a very broad spectrum, right?
Mhm.
And so they said, at no point in between shall you exist. So like talking about Blackness, at no point in between shall you exist, that you're either this or you're either that. There's like no in between, right? And yeah, so that's where the title came from. It just kind of rang out, and then it stuck, and I couldn't get rid of it. And so yeah, like yeah,
Hey.
I cut off like the second half, and it's just at no point in between. So it's like sort of referential to that, but then also like this idea of like being in a space, right? Yeah, that's where it comes from.
Yeah, and that you heard it on a drive back from taking the photos. I just think it works on many levels. That's awesome. Also, so I noticed on your site that there's a PDF, like there's a book of these photos, right? And there
Mhm.
you made the PDF of it free, which I think is so important and good. And I don't know if you could speak a little bit about um, why you decided to do that, or yeah.
Yeah, of course. So I published this work as a book, um, and I worked with another artist who also, like, he's a photographer, but he wanted to start his own imprint. And like the premise of it is just to have a deep collaborative process between the artist and the publisher. um, and so he's doing like like the design work, like yeah, like he like all of the copies of the book, the only like everything is made in-house, except for the printing that's like outsourced. um and so it, yeah, like this very intimate process. And then I think we had like a budget of like $10,000, and he's like, I'll do whatever you want, but you're only going to get like $10,000 worth of book. And so you can do something really cheap that's like kind of has a larger edition, or you can do something intricate that has a smaller edition. And so my book is like kind of maybe halfway in between that. It's just like the materials that we selected. There's like a lot of there's like a sewn in pamphlet that like we made. There's like these pictures that like these tiny little pictures in there that fall out, these special end pages. It's like black on black printing that he printed himself and then sewed into the book. So there's just like all of this stuff that kind of goes into it. And because of that, there's only 165 copies out in the world, which is unfortunate. Like, it's great that like it was this opportunity to make a book and do it exactly how I wanted. And that's exactly what happened. Like, when he sent me the first constructed copy, I was like, this is exactly what I saw in my head. This is exactly like what I wanted. Like, this is
Wow.
exactly how I felt the work should exist. Um, and so that was really great. But yeah, it was just, yeah, it's like the downside is it's like that experience is only limited to 165 people. I mean, thankfully, a lot of libraries purchased a significant portion of the edition, so it's like accessible. But yeah, you have to like go to, a library like in Pittsburgh or something. I don't know. But yeah, so putting the PDF on my site, it was just a way of being able to like share, like the work in its entirety in that sort of way. And then, like everybody can own it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that balance of like preciousness and accessibility. I think that's so impactful. And that you brought up libraries, because I was going to mention last week, I think I learned about the Radical Hood Library. Are you familiar with this? I think this like book would be so cool to be there. I just love the concept of this library that has this subject area that, maybe is not usually the majority of the bookshelves in the library. And I feel like this would be inspiring to a lot of people. So I'm glad it's in libraries, like
Yeah.
library in Pittsburgh, apparently.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So Corrections is the next collection. I'd love to hear more about how this came to be.
Yeah. So this came before At No Point in Between, just like chronologically. Yeah, so this is the work that I did. It's like my undergraduate thesis work. Also published it as a book. That book is also sold out. But yeah, anyway, yeah, so this work, I was working with kids on probation. My job title was juvenile tracker, which sounds like pretty extreme, but it's not. Like, it's just like I would just drive around Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for my shift, and make sure kids were like where they were supposed to be. I'd take them to community service, check on them at home. Sometimes I'm going to schools and talking with teachers, and just doing crisis intervention, just things like that. And so I'm working this job. I already know, like, at that point, that I want to that this wasn't like, my career, right? Like, this wasn't what I was going to do for the rest of my life. So I was like, sort of had one foot out the door. And yeah, I started studying art, and so I just I had to, like, make this project for a class. And yeah, it was just like, I don't have much time to try to figure out like something like independently driven. So I'm just going to photograph this thing that I'm deeply immersed in, and maybe other people might find it interesting. And so I'd say I like sort of went into it like really, like, yeah, there was I had to like find a lot of like ways of balancing things, so like I had to I went to my boss and was like, hey, I got this crazy idea, but I want to make sure it's okay, right? Because I didn't want to, like, just start photographing kids and then like lose my job, because it's like my livelihood. I was paying the bills. But yeah, and she was like, was like, yeah, go ahead. It just make sure you get consent, and then make sure that you don't show anyone's face, just because of like all of this information is sealed. um and so there was like that aspect of it that I had to negotiate. And then like thinking about this idea of consent, like these are minors, like they can't consent to things. Like their parents have to be consenting for them. And so like having to like construct a process of like, how do I get permission to do this? How do I explain what I'm doing? That there was like this sort of level of ethics inherently like kind of involved in what I was trying to accomplish. And so, at first I was just going to be like, okay, I'll go to the parents first. But then I was like, well, I think that's kind of weird to go to somebody's like parent first. So I would ask the kids first. And then if the kids were cool with it, then we would both go and like have a conversation with their parents, and then get their permission. And if then they were on board, then I would, like schedule a time to like make a portrait of them. And yeah, so there was that part of it. Then having to anonymize them was like the next sort of thing I had to figure out. And that wasn't like easy, like I started by like just thinking maybe I would just like, like redact, like their faces like with bars, or like maybe like blur their faces somehow, just like through digital manipulation, but that just didn't feel quite right.
Mhm.
Um, and so I started like having them like use themselves, or maybe just like, things that exist in the environment as a way of concealing identity. And it was, like a portrait heavy project at first. And that was like what I was really drawn to, was making portraits. Um, but then, like, I think I, like when I was just presenting the portraits, I think there wasn't enough of the story. Like I knew I could give you the context. This is what I do professionally for work. This is like kind of what I experience with these kids on a daily basis. But I, like the feedback that I was getting was like, how do you kind of like enrich the story and maybe do it without a way of providing very objective information, like, and like that was like something I always like sort of like people always wanted, was like, well, the kid, with the on the track, right? um like people wanting like his specific story, and I always felt reluctant. I was like, well, that's like his, that's his story to tell, like that's not like my, like I don't think I have a place to be like trying to like narrate his life in that way, because I'm only getting like a very small snippet, right? And I'm, like professionally working with him, like I'm showing up in a very particular context myself. Like I am in this role of punishment, like I'm a physical manifestation of a punishment. And so like for me to be sort of narrating that, I felt was a little dicey. But then, like in that removal of information, there was like, I refer to them as like these slippages, where, like in the absence of that objective content, like the viewer has to begin making associations on how this information connects. And so, being able to like, like how you have this document paired with, a portrait, like, you can make the assumption that like, oh, like one of these girls wrote this note, right? Or or maybe you think about absence. There's no name on the piece of notebook paper. You don't know who the author is. These girls don't have faces. Like, they're like their faces aren't shown. You can't recognize them. What does that mean in the context of, thinking about the juvenile criminal justice system and anonymity and stigma? And, like, so like that, the context, the general context of the work is going to give you something. The images are going to give you something. Obviously, like you'll like as a viewer, you'll merge those two things together if you're seeing them like in a particular way, right? In an exhibition, on a website, with a statement, and a book that has maybe some writing. But that, yeah, like, but that's what it's about, right? It's about like understanding how, we use images to understand phenomena, how we use images to understand people, right?
Yes, and I think it does make me think as well about this context of uh, corrections and the aggregate. I feel like we think about it in terms of the multitude who are imprisoned, who are arrested. But the fact that you pull out the individual and then we still can't see their face kind of speaks to like the anonymizing that happens. I don't know, it makes me think about all of those contexts. So I'm very thankful for what that work achieves. And I'm curious too, you mentioned going to the child and then going to their parents, but what are you sharing with them in that conversation? Are you like, I'm in school, I have to do a project and that's it? Or are you going into like a bit more of the systems and like the their politicization? Like, what is that like?
Yeah, I think that like, yeah, I tried to find ways of just like explaining like the basics, like, yeah, like I'm in school, yeah, I'm working on this project, but then, like that, like I'm trying to create art and art can exist in a lot of different contexts. It can mean a lot of different things, but these are the things that I'm thinking about personally, right? And then like what I noticed is that like by opening up like, you know, something intimate about me, right? I think yeah, like it's this way of building trust with somebody else, and especially given like again like the context of our relationship, like those relationships, I needed to like find ways of quickly gaining a kid's trust, because if you know if they're like like freaking out because they got into an argument with their parents, like I'm responsible for stepping into that. But if they don't trust me, they're not going to listen to me, and there's probably going to be a negative outcome, right? But that like so like the trust building was already there with the job, but like once I opened like myself up more, like this intimate space of like being an artist, and like talking with them about that, like they sort of opened up on a level too, right? Where like yeah, like the young man with the on the track, he he was like doing really well, got in a little bit of trouble, had to have this ankle monitor put on, and then it happened right at the beginning of football season. And I mean, he's just like amazing athlete. And he was like really like deeply upset by that, because being an athlete was a big part of his identity, and here he is sidelined because of choices he made, right? But he wanted to be able to express that. He opened up like this part of his life to be vulnerable, to talk about his feelings in this moment, right? And so like of course we can be like, oh well, maybe if you didn't make those decisions, you'd still be on the team, right? But that like we're all capable of making those failures, and that like yeah, it was his choice, right? But that doesn't mean that like he's not reflecting on that he's not thinking about that he's not hurt, like, and that he understands that he hurt himself, like he knows that, right? And so I think it was like being able to use that as a way of like for them to maybe express some things that are a little bit deeper. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize what like that self-disclosure at the right time with the right context can achieve for people opening up and building that trust. And you can see where your social work, social services background comes in there for sure. I'm doing my thesis right now for social work, and we talk about using an autoethnography. Like when you just talk, you like put on paper, like, what is your expectation of the situation? Like, what do you like, so that those biases are just like, let's get them out there because they're not going away in any full way. Like we're going to try to mitigate them, but they're there. They're part of who I am or who you are. And so I think it's really cool how you were cognizant in this process to reflect on what are your expectations, like what are you're thinking about. And I wondered if you do that in a like, do you carve out space for that and do it in a certain way, or is it just like when you're driving, whatever comes up, you like make a note of it? Like what's that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, are you thinking like in this particular context, like in the context of corrections,
I think in just
or
the
just
broader context of, all of the ethics that are involved in the work that you do, especially when you are at these, this crux of like social phenomena and art,
yeah.
like how you reckon with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like when I was making corrections, I feel like it was, yeah, I would just constantly be thinking about, I did a lot of driving. I lived in Cedar Rapids because being closer to work was more convenient. And then I would drive to Iowa City for work, which is like a 45-minute drive. So, or to Iowa City for school, sorry. But yeah, so I had all that time, but then the job itself was just driving around town, man, like hours on end, just driving around town. And so I would think about those, like the process, I would be thinking about it a lot.
Mhm.
I think, like now it's just maybe like considering those things has shifted, is a lot of it just comes with teaching. And, like, my role here is helping, like facilitate students being able to express what they want to express. So, that's both in the making and then how they contextualize things for themselves. Um, and a part of that is like, sometimes it can be like maybe an ethical question, but it's also to me an existential one, right? Like, the goal at the end of this, whether it's a graduate student or an undergraduate student, is to help them, and this is in my opinion, of course, but it's to help them become self-determined artists. That, you'll spend this time, with me and like your other professors and your peers, and at the end of it, like at the culmination of that experience, is that you get this degree. And what that degree means is that you can go out into the world and you can live your life as an artist exactly the way that you like can craft it, right? Um, and but like a lot of that takes it takes probing at oneself, like if you're thinking about like the actual making side of things, like what constitutes your studio practice is like a question like I'm always asking students. For me, it's like I think a lot, and then I have experiences, and then I think about those experiences, and then it all kind of builds, and then something comes out, and that might be writing, it might be like making something, like, but that's unique to me. Is like it's like kind of like a big snowball process and then some sort of release. Whereas like, some people are just like very kind of surgical. It's like I wake up, I spend 8 to 10 painting, and then I go do this thing, and then, when I get home at the end of the night, I spend from 3 to 7 painting again, right? But like that, like, again, like it's my role as a professor, in the arts. Like I'm trying to help people realize what that is for themselves, rather than like trying to prescribe something, like it's done, this way. And I think that's like, I always say that, like, I can't give you a handout, that tells you exactly what it like how to be a successful artist. Someone asked me that question, I'm just like, well, what does this being a successful artist mean to you?
Throw it right back. No, self-determination and teaching self-determination, I imagine, is no easy feat and probably very complex and nuanced, but what a rewarding thing when it gets done right. And I will jump to our this
Oh yeah.
because I think it's a kind of cool segue. So we're just gonna lean into it. So I think what's really powerful in how you show up too is that like you bring your full self and your full context and motivations. And I will just like blank slate leave this to you. I would love to hear more about what's on the screen and how it impacts your life that is on the screen, just like all the things.
Yeah, well, I think, this work for me, it has like, it comes from a lot of different experiences and has like maybe a lot of different meanings, but it does bring my full self into it. My family originated here in Arkansas. I'm now a state employee where members of my family were once enslaved. Like, like that means something to me, right? It's something that I think about. That I have to like, yeah, that I'm constantly thinking about my own race and relationship to this place. And so, all the stuff that happened on campus, how was that 2020? It seems so long ago.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that, we had, once again, students, donning blackface. We had, those students who mocked George Floyd's murder. We had, Black at UARC trending on Twitter. the questioning of, the statue of a segregationist and his namesake on a college, on our campus, that we have, we're having this reckoning with anti-Blackness as it exists at the University of Arkansas. And so, this was like, I think somebody texted me this image. They were like, holy shit, look at this tweet. And I saw it and I was just like really touched by it. Like, yeah, like this, like, let's just be very direct, and so I just enjoyed that sort of as a moment. And in my email signature, like, it says J. William Fulbright, College of Arts and Sciences. And, so like that, like, once I saw this image, it kind of like reminded me like, oh yeah, this man's name is like right underneath my name whenever I send an official, like, work email. And I'm not really into that. And so for a while, like, I put like some asterisks through his last name, and I was like, I could be doing more. And then I saw this picture and I was like, that's it. So I linked, there's a link. His name and my signature is now a link that goes to this image, right? And so one day, I'm just going about my business and I get a call from my boss, and she is like, university relations asked me to ask you to remove that link from your email. And goes on to explain that there's like legislation and then also board policy at the university that like talks about that prohibits public employees from engaging in political activities during work hours, right? And so like like my boss like didn't want to, like, she told them like, no, like, I don't agree with this. I'll ask him, but like, I'm not going to encourage him in any way to remove this. And so then she, like, when we had this conversation, I was just like, well, what do I do? And she's like, well, like with Instagram, just make sure that it's like some way, like it signifies that like, this is like, your personal account and not like a school related account, because of course those lines are kind of blurry in the digital realm. But then like for the email, like she was just like, I don't know. And so we get off the phone and I thought about it for a second. I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna turn this shit into art, because then it's like, that is a part of my job. And like, this is what I do. So, like, yeah, like try to like, I would like to see them try to ask me to remove this at this point, because then it's like, then you are telling me not to do, like, my job is telling me not to do my job. Like, right. Can we talk about how ridiculous this now is, right? So yeah, so I just made it into an artwork. Fulbright signed the Segregationist Manifesto in 1956, each one teach one. And then so there's like, I sort of expanded on the links, like I point to the university's website that has a very clear description about, Fulbright's involvement in signing the Segregationist Manifesto, right? It points out to a couple of other sources. But yeah, it's like, I don't know, I feel like, like the work that I'm making, it's just becoming more and more direct. So, you have corrections, which has a level of nuance to it, like a high level of nuance to it. At no point in between, maybe becoming a little more direct, especially when I'm like referring to these very violent moments in history. But still like a lot of nuance to like sort of get to the work. It takes a lot of time, maybe a lot of research, a lot of understanding. And then now it's just like very hyper direct. Like I'm just putting it out there. This is what it is. But I think what I've noticed is like in doing that and being completely direct or frank in the work, it has this way of actually facilitating the exact behavior that I'm talking about, and then being able to call that out like in real time, right? Which I don't know, like it's not really an easy experience by any means, I will say, to have, like your employer trying to censor you. But again, it just like, it points to like, oh, like this is how institutional racism like institutionalized racism, this is exactly how it functions, right? You don't like that a Black person is saying this, and you're trying to like remove that by citing some legislation or, you know, whatever, which is like a stupid rule anyway, but you know, out of my hands. But yeah, so it's, yeah, I think that's like where the work, you know, has like been heading, you know, over the past couple of years, is just like doing things like this, but then also thinking about like where art can appear, right? Like this, you know, of course I could put this like in a gallery space, but it actually functions better just as a basic email signature. And then you get to interact with it anytime, you know, you have a contact with me through my New York email, right?
Yeah.
And then again, like sort of mirroring, you know, like when like, you know, racist or discriminatory things happen to me here, or just in life generally, it's never at my choosing. It's not like, okay, like let me go get my dose of discrimination today, right? It
Right.
just happens. It's out of my control. And so much like this email, it's like you don't know when you might receive an email from me. And when you do, like, of course you don't have to interact with it if you don't want to, but it's such a large block of text. I'm sure it draws people's attention to like, what is this? And then it just lays out exactly what it is. But it's like kind of that idea of like, there's like a chance occurrence, like that it just sort of happens, you know, if you receive an email from me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, it's so smart. It's so interesting. It definitely caught my attention in the emails, but I think it's so impactful how you recognize like just these institutions can feel so big and so top down and so like there's no actual faces. But I feel like having a boss who could recognize the absurdity and the frustration with you also made a difference. Maybe like did you go into the role knowing that that boss was going to be able to back you in that way, or did you how do you assess for that when you're interviewing? Like are you going to stand by me when I put something in my signature that ticks people
Right.
off because I know it's coming? Like what do you do to
Yeah.
know that?
Yeah, well, I think like maybe like we have an assumption that like in art spaces, like things like this are, you know, like acceptable, right? To in the sense that like, you know, art making, you know, can be a political act, has all like, you know, like has been used, you know, politically, you know. Um and so I think it's just something that like we all recognize. And so I think there's like, yeah, you sort of, you know, you have this assumption that you'll receive that support, but that it is an assumption, right? Because it's like these are very human choices. And so, you know, thankfully I have you know, a boss that's like, I don't want any of my colleagues to be censored because I don't want myself to be censored as an artist, right? Like that, it feels terrible. It's not a good feeling. Um, and so, you know, yeah, thankfully I'm in a space where my boss is like that. Now, I'm sure there are other spaces where that's not a reality, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's like, and the only way to know is just to ask, like, how do y'all deal with censorship here? You know, but that like people can and should be asking those questions like when they take on these roles. Yeah.
I think it is super important. And I think, in other spaces might not be a reality right now, but I think it could be. Like, I think that we know that, race is part of life in every part of it. And there's probably ways. I think it's encouraging, like my reason for saying this, I think it's encouraging for other members of faculty to, if they're feeling like they're being censored, like you can be within the system and find ways to resist that also keep you earning like your income and showing up for other people, because like if you're not there, then who is? Like it's important to be in the system doing the thing and being yourself. And I love this as a chance for people to understand, like, or to start brainstorming how they might get to do that. So thank you for
Yeah,
going there with me. um
absolutely.
as we start to wrap up, I like to abstract a bit now and just understand, for you, like, why is photography the way to explore the histories of American systems and their imagery?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like there's a multitude of ways of talking about these things, and photography is just what works for me. And again, I think it just goes back to that very early interest um, in using and understanding like images as a way to tell stories, as a way to to reinforce like knowledge. And but that like but I think what always keeps me coming back to photography is like that slippage, right? Where, like it can have like these multiple meanings, like sometimes that are, like supported by very objective things, and sometimes they're just like, I don't know, like that kind of intangible kind of zone of understanding. But yeah, I'd say that's why I keep coming back to it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think also what I can maybe feel from your story and your work is that it's heavy work, and even if you weren't ultimately like censored in that one experience, like it's heavy and like disheartening to feel like someone wants to censor you, and that you have to like, what keeps you inspired and motivated? How do you keep waking up and doing this hard stuff?
Yeah, well, I think it, like for me it's maybe that like I found personal liberation through the creation of art.
Mm.
That like, like if we're talking about like At No Point in Between, I watched this very horrible video of, this teenager being murdered, right?
Mm.
That is being delivered to me through images. And like, but knowing that like if we allow ourselves like the space and time to shift the context or look a little more deeply, that we can find like these deeper truths, through these images. And so I feel like in a lot of ways, I'm just like I'm building context around things to facilitate other people getting to those deeper spaces, to those like more critical spaces. And that like, that level of criticality can be applied, to like day-to-day things, right? Like whether we're looking at, like images of police murders, or even just like, like the images that come along with advertising, because like, some that is being used to manipulate us in some way, right? If you
Yeah.
apply a level of criticality, you can start to point to like specifically what those things are. um yeah, and so I think that's just, like, yeah, just trying to get others to that space of liberation through the act of looking deeply. Yeah, that's why I'm here for it.
That's
Yeah.
cool. Bringing about all the criticality and self-determination is the doing the good work. So that's awesome. And what would your advice be to people who also want to merge artistic production with this talk about social phenomena?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like my work, like it's existed in different contexts. Like, it's like published in, like sociological research journals. It's I was invited to to speak at a symposium, like for an English program that like did outreach to incarcerated individuals. And so that like, yeah, like that, art has a great way of like kind of breaking boundaries in that sense.
Mhm.
That like it can be used in a lot of interesting ways and in different fields for things. And so there's just, such a large amount of possibility. Um, and that art, yeah, art can be a way of tapping into that possibility.
I love that. And Zora, what do you want people to leave knowing about you and about your work? And what are you looking forward to right now?
Um, I would say, like, yeah, for one thing, for people to know, or leave with from my work, um, yeah, maybe just to be more critical on a daily basis about things that make you uncomfortable,
Mhm.
that, yeah, that cause you discomfort. Um, and then what am I looking forward to? Uh, what am I looking forward to? I'm looking
Monday
forward
morning, we're
to,
starting
right?
high.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I just look forward to being able to continue teaching, like to continue, doing what I do. That, like like since I've arrived, at um, the fact that I know that I want to be an artist and I know that I want to be an educator. That really, like, every day since then has been exciting, like that. Yeah, I there's always that thrill, in, like in teaching, and in making, like in showing my work, and, getting to do things like this, right? Like that, it's always, like my decision to do that has always taken me to interesting places, and I'm sure that'll continue to happen. Yeah.
Yes, what a great affirmation going into the week, to be remembering the thrill that's there. Like sometimes in the weeds of it, I don't know, I feel a little tired. I feel a little like, why are we doing this? But no, ultimately it is so thrilling, and it does lead to so many interesting, important touch points. And I'm so thankful to you, Zora, for showing up here, for being willing to have this conversation and share your work with a different part of the world. So again, like, thank you so much. I can't wait to share your story.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to do this. It's been great.